Hello, everyone, and welcome to our, what time is it? 2 p.m. 2 p.m. Eastern CME Palooza session, CME Mythbusters. I've been looking forward to this one. So CME Mythbusters, Brian McGowan, Chief Learning Officer and co-founder of Archimedics, along with Andy Krim, Executive Director of Professional and Continuing Education at UNT Health Science Center, will be our presenters today. But before we get to that, everyone's favorite, our sponsors. Our gold sponsor, Genentech. Silver sponsors, Helio Education Lab, Global Academy for Medical Education, Forefront Collaborative, CME Matters, and ASIM. Bronze sponsors, Vindico Medical Education, Thistle Editorial, RMEI, PVI, Primary Care Network, Platform Q Health, Paradigm, MyCME, HME, Haymarket Medical Education, Connective, Impact Education, i3 Health, Highmark CE, Ethos CE, CMEology, Clinical Care Options, and ACHL. Brian, did you notice that they put them in reverse alphabetical order?
That was nice. Really nicely done.
Thank you. 3 ways that you can ask your questions, and please feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. First way is you can use the Google Slides link. It is right on the live page. It should be right above where the video is. Click on the one that says, what does it say? The one to ask me a question, to ask a question. And it'll take you right to a little slide where you can enter your questions. It's really easy. You can also send me a text, and I'll give all these questions to Brian then verbally. Our text line is 267-6660-CME. And of course, you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. Speaker disclosure that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are our own and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian. Brian is, fortunately for me, so I don't have to worry about my stupid laptop crashing again, is running the slides himself. So he's doing double duty. So I'm going to let you take it away from here, Brian. Did I miss anything in the intro, or we're all good?
I don't believe so. Just confirm for me, if you can, when my slides are appearing.
I will.
Yeah.
There we go. I see your slides. Excuse me.
Thank you very much, and thanks for everyone who's sticking around throughout the afternoon. I've done a few of the CME Paloozas, and specifically for this one, it's a presentation that I was really looking forward to, and in some ways, I'd like to say it was really, really enjoyable planning process. However, for reasons that I will share in just a second, it's been a little bit more stressful and a little bit more consternation than usual. For those who are unaware, Mythbusters, in which we're modeling this presentation, has spent about 15 seasons carefully selecting myths, then, whenever possible, empirically exploring them, looking for the validity of a myth. And if you're really interested and don't want to watch the rest of this presentation, reruns are almost certainly being played on Discovery Channel right now. The hosts are Adam Savage and Jamie Hyman. Unfortunately, they were unavailable and just not quite expert enough around continuing medical education. So Andy Krim on Twitter @PoosPop and Brian McGowan, that's myself on the right of your screen, will be serving as your host for the day. Unfortunately, Andy could not be with us today, but it was for some pretty good reason. In our rehearsal, we had a bit of an accident, and Andy actually has sent an outtake of one of our rehearsals. Maybe this will explain why he couldn't be here.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for the invitation today. I cannot wait to get some of these myths all pulled together. We're going to look at some, we're going to test them, we're going to see which ones blow up. The millennial thing. Do they learn differently? I have no idea.
Oh no.
Oh, yeah, that was a little bit surprising when that happened. Andy is actually doing okay, but Derek, as you know, the CME Palooza legal team has been in contact with us, and so we're now legally required to disclose that myth busting that you're about to experience was conducted by trained professionals. It's advised that caution be taken when conducting your own myth busting, as it may be dangerous to generally accepted convention and to the status quo. And feel free to use the hashtag #BeSafeAndy. For those who are familiar with the show, you understand that with each myth that we'll explore today, we're going to try to decide from the evidence as to whether the belief is real, and so therefore it's confirmed and not a myth, whether it is plausible, in which the evidence suggests that a belief can neither be confirmed nor busted, or whether it's busted, in which case the evidence suggests that the belief is invalid and it is in fact a myth. Time permitting, we're going to work through 4 myths today. Our first one, as Andy was very excited to present before his unfortunate accident, is the myth of generational differences. And what's important with each one of the myths is that we want to narrow it down to a testable hypothesis, if you will. So when we talk about generational differences, what we're really talking about is the belief that millennials learn differently than other learners of other generations, and therefore interventions need to be designed to address their unique needs. Specifically, the belief is that millennials learn differently, and therefore we as educators need to design our education in such a way that it addresses their needs. So let's look at what the evidence is potentially in support of this belief. So one thing we know from the literature that the AMA releases every year is that the population of clinicians is significantly graying. In fact, from 2012 to 2014, the number of older physicians, older than 60 years old, increased by 22%, while there was no other increase in the other subpopulations. We also know that as of a year or two ago, 51% of the graduating physicians, are now female. And so if you look through that the age demographic, you'll realize that while 51% of graduating physicians are female, the bulk of clinicians are older, and therefore the significant majority of clinician learners is still male. So we have a graying population with younger female physicians being trained, but the vast majority of the physician population is still male. We also have rather significant shifts in race and ethnic diversity. So compared to age and gender, this change has already arrived at our doorstep, right? So from 1980, when the white physician ratio was 8:1, to 2004, where the white physician ratio is 2:1, we know that the learners, especially the physician learners that are appearing in our courses or engaging with our activities, are much more ethnically and racially diverse. So the physicians are getting older, they're getting more female, but still the vast majority is older white males, yet the white part of the equation is slowly being diluted. But the myth is about the millennials, right? So just keep in mind all those different demographic shifts that are afoot. When you look specifically about millennials, it appears that their preferences are different. So here's data from Clinical Care Options that suggests that younger physicians' self-rated comfort level with technology is greater, or that their propensity or frequency of using online on-demand or online content of any sort is higher. So despite the reality that all the buzz around millennials, the surveys certainly support that their learning preferences may suggest that they look for different types of education. But I'd like to argue that if we ask a question, we ask the wrong question, we're going to see the wrong answer, right? So think of the difference between perception and reality when it comes to this millennial myth. So if I were to ask you on the surface whether the box around the letter A is darker than the box around the letter B, then I think on the surface, 99% of us would say that is in fact the case. But when we actually dig into the data a little bit more specifically, you realize that perception's not always reality. Likewise, if I were to ask you whether apples and oranges are similar, well, that's the analogy, right? It's like apples and oranges. They're different things. But what if we gained greater perspective? So are apples and oranges different? Well, not when you compare them to basketballs and baseballs. Now all of a sudden the similarities are greater than the differences. But what if you compared them to Earth versus Mars? Right? If you have the right perspective, then you should be able to understand that while you may be able to find a difference if you look for it, that doesn't necessarily mean the difference is real when you gain greater perspective, right? So if you look online, for example, on Wired, Atlantic, Huffington Post, Washington Post, you can find countless of headlines about tech-savvy millennials. However, as much as that popular belief exists, if you actually look at empirical data, you'll find that this millennial population is more confident. They perceive themselves to be better at technology. For example, here's a study looking at how college students use Google to search for critical information. What you find out in empirical research is that these millennials were basically clueless about the logic underlying how search engines organize or display results. Consequently, the students didn't know how to build a search that would return good sources. They're confident about their technology. They have strongly stated preferences, but the empirical data suggests that they're actually no more competent using the technology. Look at another empirical study using multimedia or best practice modern online education. And you find out that the use of best practice multimedia online education, results show that both younger and older age groups, the multimedia best practice examples were more efficient than other training formats in that less cognitive load led to at least equal performance. The millennial piece, the demographic difference piece, actually had no bearing on the effectiveness of the educational experience, which leads you to think whether the differences that you may be able to uncover if you ask the wrong question are necessarily critical or in any way determine the education that we should be designing. So let's look at some other perhaps ill-founded questions. Are learners who graduate from Hopkins School of Medicine different from those who graduate from Mercer School of Medicine? I'm sure I could ask that question in enough ways to demonstrate that they're diametrically opposed groups. But shortly after they graduate, they're both physician learners. And prior to their 4 years at Hopkins, they had similar experiences. If you look for a difference, you can find one. It doesn't mean it's important. Are pharmacists different from physicians or nurses when it comes to learning? I'm sure if you ask the question the right way, you could find some aspect of them that's different. But is that different important to learning? Are MD, PhDs different from MDs or DOs? Again, you could ask the question in a way that demonstrates some difference, but is it really important to learning? Are critical care nurses different from school nurses? I'm sure we could ask the question in a way that demonstrates a difference, but is it really important to learning? What all the literature, separate from the buzz around millennials, actually suggests is that as educators, we need to focus on the similarities. We need to focus on the way memories are formed and the challenges with moving things from short-term to working to long-term memory. That's a human reality. It's not a generational reality. We need to focus on the way schema is constructed and the challenges that all learners have with the information overload or the fire hose of information. And we need to focus on the similarities in neurophysiology that actually allow us to connect emotional engagement to memory formation. So I doubt you could do a study that would demonstrate that the hippocampal amygdala complex in a millennial is fundamentally different than the hippocampal amygdala complex in an older clinician. This is where learning takes place. Self-report and perceptions isn't where learning takes place. So if the belief is that millennials learn differently than learners of other generations, therefore interventions need to be designed to address their unique need, it's plausible that they believe they learn differently. But the myth, our first myth, is unequivocally busted. We'll move on to the second myth, unless, Derek, there's any questions that have come in either through the text line, through Google Slides, or through Twitter?
Not yet.
Okay. So the second myth that was suggested we would cover today is this idea that learners know how to learn. The specific testable hypothesis here is that learning is a natural process. Learners know their optimal approach, and therefore educators can be fully confident that good content can be optimally learned. Now, this is research that I've conducted myself. I actually went out and I interviewed 300 plus clinician learners, and I wanted to learn more about the process of learning, so I deconstruct the process that learners are using. Number two, I wanted to explore the how and the when that learners take these various actions in the course of learning. And number three, I wanted to assess how effective or how efficient the learners were at the process of learning. And this will ultimately get at that belief. Do learners know the optimal approach to make learning effective? Here's what we learned. There are 4 generally acknowledged actions that learners believe drives effective learning. And so educational planning, development, and delivery that doesn't in some way support or structure these actions is at risk of remaining minimally effective. So let's dig in a little bit more to each one of these actions. The second part of the research uncovered that when it comes to taking notes, the first learning action, learners acknowledge a jerry-rigged system of notebooks, index cards, Post-it notes, or spare paper and pads that they try to use in different situations or different circumstances to archive what it is that the information they're consuming. Number 2, the second learning action is that learners acknowledge that setting reminders is really critical to their notes having any impact. But they also acknowledge a myriad of approaches, including calendar invites, to-do lists, dog-earing the pages of their notebook, sending themselves emails, or leveraging reminder apps increasingly. The third action that learners described is the searching for layers of information while they're participating in an educational activity. And they acknowledge that they rely on smartphones, opening new browser windows, new tabs, or frighteningly, Wikipediaing or Googling to find answers to questions that arise during learning. And the fourth learning action is the recognition that learners often rely on cues from the faculty or from other learners to nudge that process of learning and to refocus their attention. So we have this mountain of research around the complexities of these critical learning actions. And so in the third part of the research, we wanted to understand how effective or efficient these actions were. Remember, the premise, the belief, is that learners have to not only understand the process of learning, but they have optimized the process of learning for themselves. And so in the third part of the research, what we uncovered is as learners reflect on the actions that they take, they quickly recognize that the actions that they take are not effectively, optimally supporting the way that they learn. It turns out, however unfortunate, the reality is that these actions that learners rely on are almost always a matter of habit and convenience, and very rarely are they a matter of trial and error. So from an educator's perspective, the experience that you create for learners must be structured in a way that it simplifies learning and it centralizes the learning actions model. And this gave rise to the learning actions model as an instructional design framework. So the final piece of this myth-busting section is that we were able to take the research around the learning actions, the model, the instructional design model that describes how to address the research, and we were able to demonstrate that by designing education in keeping with the learning actions model, it leads to changes in knowledge and competence that are 4 to 6 times greater than traditional e-learning. So simply by providing enough structure and support around the actions that learners take, the traditional types of content that our community has historically created instantly becomes 4 to 6 times more effective. So if you go back to the original belief that learning is a natural process and that learners have developed an optimal approach, therefore educators can be confident that good content can be optimally learned, I can fairly confidently say at this point that that myth, our second myth of the day, is fully busted. Just a
I do
reminder.
have a question for you.
Fire away.
I think this is though more related to your first myth, but how do we need to account for the way fellows are learning in grad school and make sure that CME is relevant to the younger and the more seasoned docs, particularly around quality improvement and team-based coordination?
Sure. So if now we're focused on professional experiences being a difference, so younger residents are driven to engage in quality improvement programs, and they're driven around the implementation sciences. So that's constructually totally different than the education, the formal education, the credit-bearing education. So I'd see those as really two different things. Is there a way that we can benefit from the fact that as younger clinicians are graduating? Let me say that again. Is there a way that we can benefit from the fact that as newer physicians are graduating, they may be more inclined or more familiar to participate in QI programs? Hell yeah. That's great. That's a huge challenge in quality improvement, is that the clinicians aren't used to it and don't care for it. I don't see that as being a demographic or millennial issue as much as being a professional experience issue. Anything else, Dave?
That's it for now.
All right, so we're moving on to the third myth, another one submitted from the community. This myth is the idea that a flipped classroom is a silver bullet. And as long as you say you're doing a flipped classroom, that by providing pre-work to learners before a live meeting, that learners will come better prepared, therefore face-to-face learning time can be dedicated to reaching deeper learning and application. That's our testable hypothesis. And so it's important just for the chance that there's somebody participating in this CME Palooza webinar who's not familiar with the flipped workshop. A flipped workshop is in essence a blended and sequential instructional design model where learners consume foundational content as pre-work prior to a live meeting. The pre-work generates data about the learning experience and about the content and about the learners that informs the faculty. The faculty then customized, adapt, or optimize the content and the strategy for the learners to apply at the live meeting. And therefore, the live meeting time is saved for deeper learning. It's driven, it's catalyzed by the data and the pre-work learning experience. And so the face-to-face time can get closer and closer to achieving an applied or practice-based learning environment. And the idea here, if you look in the general literature, is that the flipped classroom theoretically should predispose learners. It should offer sequential experiences. It should improve learner homogeneity. And this is critical, right? The idea is that by offering the pre-work, if 100% of the people do the pre-work, then you know that 100% of your learners have a shared learning experience. They have a similar building block from which you can move in some other different direction. It also allows for data-driven design in the planning and customization, and it optimizes the rather expensive in-class time. And so theoretically, you can find, and actually you can find dozens and dozens of publications that will have some chart that looks like this. We used to run the course the old way, and then we flipped it and learners learned more. And this slide is really part of the problem. It's the reason why the buzz suggests that a flipped learning experience should be a silver bullet. Now, in full transparency, I'm gonna try to share some experiences that I've had working across 4 separate flipped learning classrooms or flipped learning models. In 2013, I was asked by the Alliance Annual Planning Committee to run a flipped workshop, a pre-conference. 2014, I was asked by the ANCC to run a workshop that was flipped at their annual CME symposium. In 2015, the entire CME annual symposium for ANCC was flipped, and I chaired and directed that whole endeavor. And then more recently, I ran internal staff training for a fairly sizable supporter organization where all of the grants team, the managers, the coordinators, the directors, all went through a flipped training experience. And so these 4 experiences provided me with the opportunity to fail miserably, to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, to devise new approaches, and eventually to optimize and to identify what the key determinants of success are. And so I want to walk through each of these experiences in a little bit of detail so that you get the flavor of the pain and the success that I've had working across each one of these flipped models. The good news is, as we learned from Learners Know How to Learn myth, we were able to leverage the learning actions model as part of the pre-work, which means we were able to generate some very, very critical data, which feeds into the second step of the flipped classroom. So the pre-work that we were delivering to the learners in each one of the 4 instances was a data-driven model. And so we knew far more about what the learners had or had not done than almost any of the published literature around the flipped classroom, which meant that we weren't going into the next steps blindly. We knew what was or was not working. We had the data to decide how to be agile and how to adapt and how to make the live meeting optimal. Unfortunately, the operational parts of each one of these flipped classrooms left a little bit to be desired. So for the first Alliance flipped classroom, there are more than 110 CME educators who were participating, who had paid significant dollars to participate in a flipped classroom around the science of learning. So working with a cadre of faculty members, we created an 11-part webcam video-based curriculum. We applied the learning actions model, and our intended plan was to launch the online activities 4 weeks prior to the event. In the end, as we were walking into that live meeting, I was armed with the reality that 50% of the folks in the room had consumed any of the online content. So here's this flipped classroom model that's supposed to be blended and sequential, and we spent 6 to 8 months pre-planning and building this online content, and we were able to achieve a polarized chasm in the learners who came to sit in a live meeting, meaning 50% of them were prepared for what they thought was going to be next level learning, and 50% of them walked in that room, as learners do in almost every live meeting we've ever held. In essence, they were standing still. And so as the educator, we then had to scramble to figure out how we were going to run the live meeting when 50% of the people had done the work and 50% of the people were blind. And so the majority of that first live classroom setting had to be redevoted to serving as a refresher. And then we could spend the second half of that live workshop actually working on higher level learning and working on application. And so much of that has to do with the fact that when we planned this all out, we saw this beautiful model of outreach and communication. Week 1, there's this curriculum, come watch Dr. McGowan and Dr. Keys and Dr. Balmer. And in week 2, 25% of the learners who are coming to the pre-conference have already watched Dr. McGowan and Dr. Balmer and Dr. Keys. And in week 3, you're 1 in 4 people who hasn't done their homework yet, and we were going to gamify and pull the learners all the way through. When the Alliance staff operationalized it, week 1 went by, there were no announcements. Week 2 went by, there were no announcements. Finally, a week and a half before the live meeting, an announcement went out that there's some content online. And then 1 second email went out that said, by the way, there's content online. And what we ended up seeing is that of the 50% who engaged with the online content, the vast majority of them did that the weekend before the Alliance meeting, which meant the data was ticking and ticking and ticking and ticking while I was about to get on a plane and fly to the Alliance meeting, giving me very little time to actually do anything with the data. Now, we tried this later that year, this time educating 125 nurse educators, using a similar curriculum of 11 webcam videos. This time it started on time, 4 weeks prior to the live event. In this experience, 80% of the folks who walked in the room had consumed the online content. That gave us access to nearly 4,000 documented learning actions, assessment questions, poll responses, navigation through which content did they choose first, confidence questions, evaluations. And that second version, the second instance of the flipped classroom led to the Alliance awarding us with the CPD Innovation of the Year award. So we obviously learned enough that we could try again, but then we came back the next year with ANCC, and this year we wanted to see if we could change the way the online content was experienced. We we saw a lot of challenges with the way the webcam videos were being produced. Between you and me, I had to do most of the production work, because if you give certain faculty members a video camera, nothing good happens. So the second time we went to work with ANCC, we decided to go with narrated PowerPoints. And now, instead of that face-to-face online experience, we held a Meet the Faculty webinar as part of the pre-work. We launched the education 4 weeks early, this time with the narrated PowerPoints versus webcam videos. 90% of the learners participated in the pre-work. Those learners who engaged in the online content completed 98% of the activities. We had over 2,000 documented learning actions. And this flipped classroom, this was on interprofessional education. This flipped classroom was among the highest rated interventions the ANCC has ever held. So we learned that the content in the pre-work, we have some control over it, And maybe we don't have to spend all the energy and all the effort on webcam, camera, video. Maybe slides with audio gives us enough of an experience, especially within the learning actions model, that the learners are still actively engaged. The last time we held the flipped classroom was in many ways a very different experience. It's not 100+ learners who are going to come together in a conference room at a hotel or a convention center. It was 12 members, co-workers, within a large granting department. And those co-workers were presented with a 7-part curriculum, again, using narrated PowerPoints. And again, we hoped to launch the pre-work training 4 weeks prior to the event, and then after the live workshop to hold a capstone session that said, okay, now what have you applied a month later? Here, the issue wasn't with staff communicating and outreaching with over 100 registrants from a live meeting. It was the fact that work got in the way. And here was the director of this department who wanted to run a flipped classroom, was really excited around this content about empowering her staff members around the science of learning. She was out of the country for a week and a half. The directors in her group were out of the country for a week and a half. None of that coincided. And I think eventually the education got launched about a week and a half before I was flying out to spend a day with the group. So here we had the same operational issues that we had the first time, but because it was a department, because it was assigned by their boss, because they knew that they were going to be sitting in a room with me for 4 hours, even though we didn't give them adequate time, comfortably adequate time to go in and consume the content, the existing hierarchy and the existing connections between the coworkers, that close-knit culture, drove engagement. This time, we had 100% of the learners complete 100% of the activities. Okay, so what do we learn from all these experiences? We started by saying that the basic hypothesis of the flipped classroom is that you give them pre-work, the pre-work generates data, the faculty use the data, and the face-to-face time is saved for deeper learning. This is the silver bullet. In reality, we can't make assumptions that learners will do the work. But without the data, you'll never know whether learners did or did not do anything or what they did. So as a faculty member, you have to make sure that you have access to the data, but you also need to remain open to what that data tells you. And anyone on this webinar who's planned a live meeting, you know that the 72 to 96 hours before that live meeting are pure hell. Everything is culminating in those last 4 or 5 days. If you run a flipped classroom, you now have the added burden of having to analyze that data, adapt the educational program, and remain flexible to what you're doing in the face-to-face time. So all of that stress that builds up to a live meeting, that stress is going to rise to all new levels when you try to implement a flipped classroom. So if the belief is that the flipped classroom is a silver bullet and all you need to do is give them the pre-work, look at a little bit of data, and move forward, I don't think there's any doubt that the flipped classroom is not a silver bullet. Added complexity, added resources. If it's done right, there is unquestionably added value, but it's not a silver bullet. Derek, how are we doing on your side?
Good. I have one or two actually for you. The first one, I think you maybe sort of already addressed. I'll give it to you. You can just go through it quickly again. But someone was maybe assuming that this myth would be at least plausible. And so they were wondering about 3 keys, I guess maybe, that you'd be able to make the myth plausible, or maybe just 3 keys in general for the flipped classroom to work well in your organization from your experience.
Absolutely. So the idea that you can give somebody, send them to a YouTube video or give them some assigned reading and you're running a flipped classroom, we got to stop that. That is not a flipped classroom. That is just homework you've given to somebody before. So whatever the pre-work experience is, it has to generate data that describes what the learners did or did not do and how they did or did not learn. So number two is understanding that you have to have data. Are you actually flexible enough? Do you have the resources and the energy to analyze that data and adapt what's going on at the live meeting? And I can tell you that there is a very, very well-respected former president of the Alliance who was on the original Alliance flipped classroom experience, and he turned his slides in for the live meeting 30 days early. And he said, look, here's my slides. I'm ready to go. I'll see you in Orlando. And at that point, he said, I don't have the time over the next 2 or 3 weeks to change what I'm going to present. But I think that what I'm going to present is probably good enough. So if you're not flexible, you're not working with faculty members that are flexible, the flipped classroom is not something you should devote a lot of energy to. And finally, that applied piece, right? Understanding how to connect the pre-work content to higher level learning or application. There's no objective roadmap on how to do that. So you really need to not only have access to the data to be flexible, but you're going to have to make some decisions about what that data means in terms of what you need to do at the live meeting. And there's just, that's as much, at this point, I think that's as much art as it is science. Good? Yep.
One more for you. You can run through this quick, and then we'll you can move on to your last myth. This is interesting. So what did you learn about learners who engaged early with the content versus those who engaged 24 to 48 hours before? Did their learning vary?
So that is a great question. Here's what the faculty, when we were regrouping, going through the data, this is what we said to ourselves. I can't believe we've spent all this time and invested all this energy, and these learners are procrastinating and not using the data or not using the pre-work. I can't believe that they're lazy. That was our first, in full transparency, that was our first interpretation of how the experience was unfolding in front of us. And then we got to the live meeting. And in the live meeting, 2 opinions were shared with us. One of them is a learner who, as we were talking about the flipped learning experience, she said, I looked at the content over the weekend. This was like a Monday or Tuesday. She said, I just looked at it over the weekend because I was worried that if I looked at the content when you first announced it, I would have forgotten it all before I got in this room. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't procrastinating. She actually made an active, rational choice that by engaging in the content closer to the live meeting, she would be in a better position in the live meeting. Another person raised their hand and said, I just registered last week. Well, that's an operational challenge that anyone who's going to try to run a flipped classroom in kind of these large symposia-like situations is going to have to deal with. How much of your registration happens 4 weeks or 6 weeks before the meeting, and how much of your registration happens a week before the meeting? Well, you better have a way that when people register a week before, 72 hours before, even 24 hours before, you better have a way to make sure that those individuals have at least access to that pre-work. And the reality will be there will always be, in those open symposium-like flipped classrooms, there will always be people that register on site. Nothing you can do about it. So did we learn anything different between the late learners and the early learners? We never really looked at the data, the effectiveness, the efficiency of the learning experience, because we heard that it wasn't just a demographic difference between late and early. it was certain people were making choices about late versus early that would have confounded anything we could have measured. Think that answers it, Derek?
I think that was perfect.
All right.
10 minutes to go.
Yep, and we're in perfect shape here. So our fourth myth that was submitted is this idea of learning styles. Again, our testable hypothesis is that learners are hardwired to learn more effectively in one of three styles: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and therefore educators should design content to meet a learner's objective style. Now, the reality is this visual, auditory, kinesthetic model, the VAC model of learning styles, is just one of uncountable different proposed learning style frameworks, including learning style frameworks that have 71 separate objective styles. But in essence, the idea behind any of these models, and the idea behind the VAC model, which is probably the most widely known, is that it allows you to segment learners and therefore to optimally design interventions that prioritize either a visual, an auditory, or a kinesthetic experience. Now, for those who've been down this road before, you may see some parallels between learning styles and this other thing, the cone of experience. This is just a small set of different versions of what's come to be known as Edgar Dale's cone of experience. And I'm going to blow one up. This is my favorite of all of these cones of experience. This one suggests that learners remember 10% of what they read, 20% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, 50% of see and hear, and 90% of what we say and do. In essence, they can put some type of objective measure to how much a person learns depending on the stimuli through which they were learning. Now, as a little bit of background, the cone itself was invented by Edgar Dale. The numbers, after 2 weeks, we remember 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, absolute hogwash. It was thrown into a slide deck 30 years after Dale created his cone. And even 3 to 4 years after Dale created his cone, he had to publish in a new version of his textbook an entire chapter that said, "My cone is being abused and misunderstood." So, Confucius has nothing to do with Dale's cone of experience. These data, these objective measures, have zero to do with Dale's cone of experience. And so with that as construct, I think you kind of know where I'm going on this one. For us to believe that learning styles are important, that they're real, that they're objective, that they're hardwired, someone would need to do a test that takes an auditory learner and forces them into a kinesthetic course, or separately forces them into a visual course, or separately forces them into an auditory course. And you'd have to believe that those three things are mutually exclusive. And the data would have to demonstrate that learners who find themselves or believe that they are auditory learners significantly outperform as learners in an auditory course compared to auditory learners in a visual course or auditory learners in a kinesthetic course. And this study, or forms of this study, have never been done. In fact, if you go through the literature on learning styles, if you look at the thought leaders in educational design and the science of learning, you'll see headlines like this: "The concept of learning styles is the greatest neuroscience myth. The myth is thriving in higher education. It's not an effective guide, and it may represent the educational equivalent of homeopathy," which means it kind of makes you feel good that you're doing something different, but there's zero data or zero evidence in support of it. Why this is a problem is because 94%, this is one study that suggested that 94% of research papers that describe instructional design start in their introduction with the premise that learning styles is a positive, real, actual thing. So regardless of what the research in that article is designed to prove, the opening sentence says, given what we know about learning styles and their impact on learners, they're starting with a premise that's totally ungrounded in the literature. And making matters worse, 93 to 96% of teachers in multiple studies in multiple countries believe that learning styles are true. They believe that they should be spending time trying to individualize the education they create for their learners based on learning styles. They're investing energy and hours and finances in trying to differentiate education based on learning styles. The reality is there's a small glimpse of truth in as much as in cognitive load theory, it's suggested that we balance our short-term memory based on visual and auditory inputs. And so if there's a balance of visual and auditory inputs, then that gives us a little bit more leeway, a little bit more processing power, so we can move things through working memory. But there's no literature that suggests that Derek can only intake sounds and that Anne can only intake images. So again, I think you know where I'm going with this one. If the premise is that they're hardwired and therefore educators should design content to meet the learner's objectives, I think it's plausible that people perceive themselves to learn one way or the other. But absence of any empirical data that demonstrates that that is in fact objective, I believe that the fourth myth, learning styles, needs to be busted. And with that, Dee, closing slide, open to any other questions that you have before you close us out.
We had one last one for the last myth. It's fairly simple. It's just, why are the theory of the learning styles, why is that so popular with people?
For two reasons. One of them is because when people see Dale's cone of learning, or when they get bombarded by for-profit educational consulting companies describing their unique proprietary way to customize and segment education based on their learning styles, it sounds like it's credible. And every educator worth their salt is interested in ensuring that the education that they design is personalized and customized. And therefore, when we hear things like millennial differences, we run to it like it's a shiny silver object. And when we hear things like learning styles, we run to it like a shiny silver object. And it's really incumbent on us as the educators to fact check these things and to not get sucked into them. But when you're looking in published literature and it opens by saying, given everything we know about learning styles, we've conducted this study, and the peer reviewers for that journal haven't written back to the author and said, you can't start this publication with that statement. When they're not doing that, then they're doing a disservice to the entire science of education. We have to do better, but the cards are stacked against us. There's a lot of places you can look that would suggest this is fact. Millennials are tech savvy, just Google it. It doesn't mean they're actually tech literate or tech competent. Great.
And then you had one last comment from your friends at LVHN saying that they loved your session and were thrilled to listen in. So shout out to Lehigh Valley.
Thank you, and I can't wait to go up and join those guys in the spring for their educational day.
There you go. All right, we are right up against our time limit, so perfect timing. Thanks, Brian, a lot. That was really great. Got a lot of nice feedback. And for my part, for everyone watching, please, if you haven't already done so, please take the survey. It's right on the live CME Palooza live page. It should take you about 60 seconds to do. It's only about 7 questions. that, we are moving on to the next session that Scott will have up on the website as soon as we close this one out. You just have to refresh your screen to bring up the next video. And it is common and not so common case conundrums in CME. Extra credit if you're able to spell conundrum correctly on the first shot. I could not. Okay, with that, I think we're good. Thanks again, Brian. I will talk to you later on.
Thank you.